Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library, and welcome to another reading of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. Today we are going to be reading chapters 19 and 20, and just to recap briefly, in our previous chapters, our hero, Professor Pierre Aronnax, has agreed to go on a hunting trip with Captain Nemo and one of his sailors, and of course his faithful manservant Conseil goes along with the good professor. And through it, they see this underwater forest and they go hunting for some animals, which they find. They narrowly escape a shark, which has come around to check the area out. So a little bit of tension, a little bit of adventure there, and then they trek all this way to this underwater forest. They trek all the way back at the end of it, and they when they return to the Nautilus, they they're sailing along under the water, and they are seeing a ship ahead of them that has been sunk, and it is um, not a military ship, but just sort of a regular vessel, excuse me. And it is, it's been sunk so recently that they can still see the bodies in the ocean, and they have not even had a chance yet to, decay as that sort of thing happens in the water. And so it's kind of a sad ending in the sense that uh, they see all these people and they don't know what's happened. They only see that this ship has been most recently sunk, and that if not all, at least a good portion of the passengers on board have perished as a result. So, with that very downer of an ending to our last chapter, we will begin chapter 19. So, with book in hand, I'll start here. Chapter 19 is entitled Vanikoro. This terrible sight was the first of a series of maritime disasters which the Nautilus was to meet on its way. When it sailed through more frequented waters, we often saw sunken hulls rotting in the ocean, and yet deeper we came across cannons, cannonballs, anchors, chains, and 1,000 other iron objects being devoured by rust. But the Nautilus went on, carrying us with it in a life of isolation. Then, on December 11th, we sighted Tuamotu Archipelago, which Bougainville had considered so dangerous, and which stretches out over 1,300 miles from east-southeast to west-northwest between 13 degrees 30 minutes and 23 degrees 50 minutes south latitude, and 125 degrees 30 minutes and 151 degrees 30 minutes west longitude. From Ducie to Lazareff Island. This archipelago covers an area of 330 square miles and consists of about 60 island groups, among which is the Gambier group, over which France has imposed its rule. They are all coral islands. A slow but steady rising due to the work of polyps will one day connect them one to the other. Then this new island will later become welded to neighboring archipelagos, and a fifth continent will stretch from New Zealand to New Caledonia all the way to the Marquesas. Once, when I was presenting this theory to the captain, he answered coldly, "It isn't new continents the Earth needs, but new men." Our course had taken us in the direction of Clermont-Tonnerre Island, one of the most peculiar of the whole group, which was discovered in 1822 by Captain Bell of the Minerva. I was therefore able to study the way in which these islands had been built up by the madrepores. Madrepores, which must not be confused with corals, are basically a fabric covered with a limestone crust, and their variations of structure led my illustrious teacher, Milne Edwards, to class them in 5 sections. The tiny creatures which produce this polypary live in the millions inside their cells, and it is their limestone deposits which turn into rocks, reefs, and islands. Sometimes they form a circular ring around a lagoon or lake, which is kept in contact with the sea by gaps in the surrounding wall. Other times they form barrier reefs like those off the coast of New Caledonia and various of the Tuamotu Islands. And yet other places like Reunion Island or Mauritius, they have formed steep, high, fringing reefs next to which the ocean drops off to considerable depths. As we cruised only several hundred yards off of Clermont-Tonnerre Island, I gazed in admiration at this huge edifice built by microscopic workers. These walls had been formed by several kinds of madrepores, principally millipores, astrea, and meandra. These polyparies grow mainly in the more agitated water near the surface and thus build their foundations from above, foundations which slowly sink along with the remains of secretions supporting them. This, at least, is Darwin's theory, one which I feel is superior to that which says that these madrepores are built up on the tops of mountains or volcanoes, submerged only several feet below the surface of the sea. I was able to observe these strange walls from very near, for where they dropped off into the deep water, our sound read more than 1,000 feet. In addition, our electric light made this brilliant limestone sparkle. Conseil asked me how long it took these colossal reefs to form, and I astonished him greatly by telling him that scientists had calculated that they grew at a rate of 1/8 of an inch per century. So, in order for the walls to grow this high, he said, it must have taken 192,000 years, Conseil, and we would therefore have to stretch biblical times much further back into the past. Besides, the formation of coal, that is to say, the mineralization of forests buried by floods, required an even longer period of time. But when they use the word day in the Bible, they must mean whole epochs and not just the time from one sunrise to the next. For according to the Bible itself, the sun does not date from the first day of the creation. When the Nautilus came back to the surface, I could make out the entire island of Clermont-Tonnerre, with its low tree-covered outline, its madreporic rocks, and had evidently been fertilized by waterspouts and storms. One day, a seed brought by a hurricane from nearby lands fell on its limestone surface, covered with decomposed fish and marine plants, which formed a kind of primitive soil. Then a coconut brought by the waves arrived on this new shore. It took root. As it grew, the tree prevented water from evaporating. A stream was born. Then, little by little, vegetation gained ground. Several small creatures, worms and insects, arrived on tree trunks, which the wind had torn from neighboring islands. Turtles came to lay their eggs there. Birds nested in the young trees. Thus, animal life developed. And finally, man, attracted by its fertility, appeared. This is how microscopic animals built islands. Towards evening, Clermont-Tonnerre melted into the distance, and the Nautilus then altered its course considerably. After touching the Tropic of Capricorn at 135 degrees west longitude, it started off in a west-northwesterly direction, making its way through the intertropical zone. Even though the summer sun beat down fiercely, we felt no discomfort from its heat, for at depths of 100 to 150 feet below the surface, the temperature never rose above 50 or 55. On December 15th, we passed to the west of the bewitching Society Islands and charming Tahiti, the queen of the Pacific. That morning I saw several miles to leeward the high mountains of this island. The waters near it furnished us with excellent fish for our menus: mackerel, bonito, albacore, and several varieties of sea serpent called muniforae. The Nautilus had by then traveled 8,100 miles. 9,720 had been recorded on the log when it passed between the Tonga Islands, where the crews of the Argo, the Port-au-Prince, and the Duke of Portland had perished, and the Samoan archipelago, where Captain Langle, the friend of La Perouse, was killed. We then passed near the Fiji Islands, where the savages had massacred the sailors of the Union, and Captain Bureau from Nantes, commander of the amiable Josephine. This archipelago stretches 300 miles from north to south and 720 miles from east to west. It lies between 6 degrees and 2 degrees south latitude and 174 degrees and 179 degrees west longitude. It comprises a certain number of islands, islets, and reefs, among which most important are Viti Levu, Vanua Levu, and Kandavu. It was Tasman who discovered this group in 1643, the year Torricelli invented the barometer and Louis XIV mounted the throne. I leave the reader to decide which of these events was more useful to the human race. Then came Cook in 1714, de Estrecasteaux in 1793, and Dumont d'Urville in 1827, untangled the geographic web of this archipelago. The Nautilus headed for Wailea Bay, where Captain Dillon, who first uncovered the mystery of La Perouse's shipwreck, had such terrible adventures. The bay was dragged several times and furnished a vast amount of excellent oysters. We ate an enormous amount, opening them right at the table, as Seneca advised. These mollusks belong to the species called Ostrea eomatosa, which is very common off of Corsica. The Wailea oyster bed must have been enormous, and surely without many forces destroying them, these beds would end up filling the world's bays, for up to 2 million eggs have been counted within a single oyster. The only reason Ned Land did not regret his gluttony is that the oyster is the only article of food that never causes indigestion. In fact, it takes at least 16 dozen of these creatures to furnish the 315 grams of nitrogenous substance that are necessary for a man's daily sustenance. On December 25th, the Nautilus was navigating among the New Hebrides, which was discovered by Quiros in 1606, explored by Bougainville in 1768, and given their present name by Cook in 1773. The main part of this group is formed by 9 large islands, stretching out in a line 360 miles long from north-northwest to south-southeast, situated between 15 degrees and 2 degrees south latitude, and between 164 degrees and 168 degrees east longitude. We passed fairly close to Aru Island, which seemed like a mass of green forests dominated by a very high peak. It was Christmas Day, and Ned Land seemed to feel very keenly the lack of any celebration, for among Protestants it is the most important of all their holidays. I had not seen Captain Nemo for a week, when on the morning of the 27th he entered the lounge, and, as always, he acted as if he had just left us 5 minutes before. I was busy tracing the Nautilus's course on the map when the captain came over, put his finger on a certain place on the chart, and spoke only one word: Vanikoro. It was a magic name. This was the island where La Perouse's ships had foundered. I got up brusquely. "Is the Nautilus taking us to Vanikoro?" "Yes, Professor," replied the captain. "And will I be able to visit this famous island where Boussole and Astrolabe went aground?" "If you would like to, Professor." When will we get to Vanikoro?" "We're there now, Professor." With Captain Nemo following me, I went up on the platform and anxiously scanned the horizon. To the northeast there emerged two volcanic islands of different heights, and surrounded by a coral reef measuring 40 miles in circumference. We were in front of Vanikoro itself, which Dumont d'Urville had named Recherche, and more precisely in front of the little harbor of Vanu, situated at 16 degrees 4 minutes south latitude and 164 degrees 32 minutes east longitude. The land seemed covered with greenery, from the beach to the peaks in the interior, dominated by Mount Kapogo, 2,856 feet high. After crossing the outer fringe of rocks through a narrow strait, the Nautilus found itself inside the reef, in waters that varied between 180 and 240 feet in depth. Under the green shade of some mangrove trees, I could make out several natives showing signs of extreme surprise at our arrival. To them, this long black object, moving forward and scarcely rising above the surface, probably seemed like some giant whale. In any case, it apparently filled them with fear and distrust. Just then, Captain Nemo asked me what I knew about La Perouse's shipwreck. "Only what everyone knows, Captain," I answered. "And could you please tell me what everyone knows?" he asked in a somewhat sarcastic tone of voice. "Certainly." I told him what had been made known by Dumont d'Urville's last words, which I will give a brief resume. In 1785, La Perouse and his second-in-command, Captain Langle, were sent by Louis XVI on a trip around the world. They embarked in two corvettes, the Boussole and the Astrolabe, which were never seen again. In 1791, the French government, justifiably anxious about the fate of these two corvettes, fitted out two large store ships, the Recherche and the Espérance, which left Brest on September 28th under the command of Bruni de Entrecasteaux. 2 months later, it was learnt through the testimony of a certain Bowen, commander of the Albermale, that the wrecks of sunken ships had been seen on the coast of New Georgia. But de Entrecasteaux paid no attention to this information, which seemed very dubious, and instead headed for the Admiralty Islands, which a Captain Hunter had designated as a place of La Perouse's shipwreck. He searched in vain. The Espérance and the Recherche even passed right in front of Vanikoro without stopping. Moreover, the trip ended very badly, for it cost de Entrecasteaux his life, as well as that of two of his first mates and several of the crew. It was Captain Dillon, an old hand at sailing Pacific waters, who first found undeniable evidence of the shipwrecked men. On May 15th, 1824, his ship, the St. Patrick, was passing by Tikopia Island, one of the New Hebrides, where a native sailor in a dugout canoe came alongside and sold them an engraved silver sword hilt. This native, moreover, said that when he had been in Vanikoro 6 years before, he had seen 2 Europeans from some ships that had gone aground many years before on the reefs of the island. Dillon guessed that these were La Perouse's ships, whose disappearance had caused such a stir throughout the world. He tried to sail to Vanikoro, where, according to this native, there were still numerous remains of the ships, but contrary winds and currents prevented him from doing so. Dillon returned to Calcutta, where he was able to interest the Asiatic Society and the East India Company in his discovery. A ship, which he had christened the Recherche, was put at his disposal, and he left January 23rd, 1827, accompanied by a French agent. After stopping at several Pacific ports, the Recherche anchored off Vanikoro on July 7th, 1827. In this same Vanu harbor where the Nautilus was now floating. There he found many remains of the wrecked ships, iron implements, anchors, grommets from pulley blocks, mortars, an 18-pound shot, fragments of astronomical instruments, a piece of taffrail, and a bronze bell, with the following inscription, "Bazin made me," which was the mark of the foundry of the Brest arsenal around 1785. There could be no further doubt. Dillon remained on the scene of the wreck until October to glean whatever additional information he could. He then left Vanikoro and headed for New Zealand. After putting in at Calcutta on April 7th, 1828, he returned to France, where he was very warmly received by Charles X. But in the meanwhile, Dumont d'Urville, without knowing about Dillon's discovery, had already left to search for the wrecked ships elsewhere. For a whaler had reported finding some medals and a cross of St. Louis in the hands of savages of the Louisade Archipelago and New Caledonia. Dumont d'Urville had therefore set out to sea in the Astrolabe, and 2 months after Dillon had left Vanikoro, d'Urville anchored off Hobart. There he found out about Dillon's work, and in addition he learned that a certain James Hobbs, first mate of the Union from Calcutta, had gone ashore on an island situated at 8 degrees 18 minutes south latitude and 156 degrees 30 minutes east longitude, and had seen some natives using iron bars and wearing red cloth. Dumont d'Urville was somewhat perplexed that he did not know if he could believe the stories he had read in rather unreliable newspapers. He nevertheless decided to follow in Dillon's footsteps. On February 10th, 1828, the Astrolabe appeared off Tikopia, took a deserter living on that island as a guide and interpreter, headed for Vanikoro, and sighted it on February 12th. D'Urville skirted its reefs until the 14th, and only on the 20th did he anchor inside the barrier in Vanu Harbor. On the 23rd, several ship's officers walked around the island and brought back some remains of no importance. The natives, adopting a system of denial and evasion, refused to show them where the accident had taken place. This shiftiness made them think that the natives had maltreated the shipwrecked men, and in fact they seemed to fear that Dumont d'Urville had come to avenge La Perouse and his unfortunate companions. Nevertheless, on the 26th, the natives, finally won over by presents and understanding that they had no reason to fear reprisals, led the first mate, Monsieur Jacquinot, to the scene of the shipwreck. There, In 20 or 25 feet of water between the Pacu and Vanu reefs lay anchors, cannons, and iron, a lead ballast, all caked with limestone deposits. The longboat and the whaleboat of the Astrolabe were sent to the spot, and after long, exhausting effort, their crew was able to haul up an anchor weighing 1,800 pounds, a cast iron 8-pound cannon, a piece of lead ballast, and 2 copper guns. Dumont d'Urville questioned the natives and found out that La Perouse, after having lost his 2 ships on the reefs, had built a smaller vessel, only to go down a second time. Where? Nobody knew. Then, beneath a clump of mangrove trees, the commander of the Astrolabe erected a memorial to the famous navigator and his companions. It was a simple 4-sided pyramid on a coral base, with no iron fittings to tempt the natives. Then Dumont d'Urville wanted to leave, but since his crew had come down with fever, common in these unhealthy islands, and since he himself was very sick, he was unable to weigh anchor till the 17th of March. In the meanwhile, the French government had become worried that Dumont d'Urville did not know about Dillon's discovery, and had sent to Vanikoro a corvette stationed on the west coast of America called the Bayonnaise, under the command of Librarian de Tromelin. The Bayonnaise anchored off Vanikoro several months after the departure of the Astrolabe. It found nothing new, but was able to report that the savages had not touched the memorial to La Perouse. This is essentially what I told Captain Nemo. So it's still not known, he said, where the 3rd ship constructed by the shipwrecked men perished. No, no one knows. Captain Nemo said nothing, but beckoned me to follow him into the lounge. The Nautilus sank several yards below the surface, and the panels opened. I rushed to the window, and beneath incrustations of coral, fungi, Symphonolae, Alcyone, Cariophyllae, and through myriads of lovely fish, girelles, Glyphocerans, Pompheridae, Diacopae, Holocentri, I could make out objects the dredges had been unable to bring up. Iron stirrups of foot ropes, anchors, cannons, shot, capstan fittings, a stem post, all of them from the sunken ships, which were now covered with a carpet of living flowers. While I was looking at these pitiful wrecks, Captain Nemo said gravely, "On December 7th, 1785, Commander La Perouse left with the Boussole and Astrolabe. He first anchored at Botany Bay, afterward visited the Friendly Islands and New Caledonia, headed for the Santa Cruz archipelago, and then put in at Nomuka in the Hapai Islands. Finally, his ships arrived near the unknown reefs of Vanikoro. The Boussole, which was in the lead, ran aground on the southern shore. The Astrolabe, which came to its assistance, and suffered the same fate. The first ship was destroyed almost immediately, but the second, stranded to leeward, held together for several days. The natives received the shipwrecked men quite warmly. They installed themselves on the island and built a smaller vessel from the remains of the other 2. Several sailors chose to remain in Vanikoro. The others, weak and ill, left with La Perouse. He headed for the Solomon Islands, where there perished with all hands on the western coast of the main island group between Cape Deception and Cape Satisfaction." "But how do you know all this?" I asked. "Here is what I found on the spot of their last shipwreck." Captain Nemo showed me a tin box, stamped with the French coat of arms, and all corroded by salt water. He opened it, and I saw a bundle of papers, all yellow, but still legible. They were the actual instructions of the Minister of the Navy to Commander La Perouse, annotated along the margins with Louis XVI's own handwriting. "Ah, what a fine death for a sailor," said Captain Nemo. "How tranquil it is! How tranquil is a coral tomb! And may the heavens grant that my companions and I be buried in no other." Chapter 20, entitled Torres Strait. During the night of December 27th and 28th, the Nautilus left the shores of Vanikoro and cruised off at high speed. We headed southwest, and in 3 days we had covered the 2,000 miles separating La Perouse's islands from the southeast tip of New Guinea. Early on the morning of January 1st, 1868, Conseil joined me on the platform. "With Monsieur's permission," he said, "I would like to wish Monsieur a Happy New Year." "What? Conseil, you act just as if I were still in Paris in my office next to the Botanical Gardens. But I accept your good wishes, and thank you. I would only like to know what you mean by a Happy New Year in our present situation. Will this year see the end of our imprisonment, or will it merely see us continuing our voyage?" "To tell the truth," replied Conseil, "I really don't know how to answer Monsieur's question. There is no doubt about it. We've been seeing many strange things for 2 months now, and we haven't even had time to be bored. Besides, the last marvel is always the most astonishing one, and if things keep getting better this way, I can't imagine how they'll end. It's my opinion that we'll never see anything quite like this again." "Never again, Conseil. And what's more, Captain Nemo really lives up to his name. He could scarcely uh, he could scarcely bother us less if he didn't exist at all." And there's a note here to say that Nemo, the word Nemo, is a Latin word meaning no man or nobody. So when he says Captain Nemo really lives up to his name, he's saying he's not really all in their business all the time. He's not often there. Back to the story. That's right. I therefore think, with Monsieur's permission, that a Happy New Year would be one in which one which would allow us to see everything. To see everything, Conseil. That would take a long time. But what does Ned Land think?" "Ned Land completely disagrees with me," answered Conseil. "He has a positive mind and a very demanding stomach. He is getting tired of looking at fish and eating nothing else day after day. He feels the lack of meat, bread, and wine. It's hard for a Saxon to go without his beefsteaks and his dash of brandy or gin." "As for me, Conseil, that isn't what bothers me, and I found it easy to get accustomed to the diet on board." "So have I," replied Conseil. "That's why I think as much about staying as Ned Land does about escaping. So if the coming year is bad for me, it will be good for him, and vice versa. This way, one of us is sure to be happy. But as for Monsieur, I wish him whatever will make him happy." "Thank you, Conseil. Only we'll have to put the New Year's presents off for some other time, and for now be content with a good handshake. That's all I have to give at the moment." "Monsieur was never so generous," answered Conseil. And with this, the fine young fellow was off. On January 2nd, we had traveled 11,340 miles, or 5,250 leagues, from our point of departure in the Japan Sea. In front of the Nautilus's prow stretched the dangerous waters of the Coral Sea off the northeast coast of Australia. Our boat cruised several miles off this fearful shoal, against which Cook's ships almost ran aground on June 10, 1770. Cook's vessel struck a rock, but it did not sink, thanks to the fact that the piece of coral it had hit came loose and stuck in the hull. I would have liked very much to visit this 1,000-mile-long reef, against which waves broke with the intensity of thunderclaps. But just then the Nautilus's side fins drew us down to a great depth, and I was able to see nothing of these high coral walls. I had to be content with the various specimens of fish brought up by our nets. Among others, I noticed some albacore, a species of mackerel about the size of a tuna with bluish flanks, and vertical stripes which disappear when it dies. Whole schools of these fish accompanied us and furnished our table with an excellent dish. We also brought in a large number of gilt heads, and about a quarter of an inch long, which tasted like dorado, and flying peripetes, veritable underwater swallows, which on dark nights streak both air and water with their phosphorescent gleams. Among mollusks and zoophytes, I found in the meshes of the dragnet various species of Alcyonarea, sea urchins, hammer shells, spur shells, solaria, Cerithia, and Cavalinia. Plant life was represented by lovely floating seaweed, Laminaria macrocystis, impregnated with that gum that seeps through their pores, and among which I picked out a marvelous Nemestoma galliniaroidea, which was placed alongside the other curiosities of nature in the museum. 2 days after crossing the Coral Sea, on the 4th of January, we sighted the coast of New Guinea. It was then that Captain Nemo told me he intended to reach the Indian Ocean by passing through Torres Strait. But that was all he said. Ned was pleased to hear that we were drawing nearer to European waters. Torres Strait, which separates Australia and New Guinea, is dangerous not only because of its reefs, but also because of the savages who live along its coast. To the north lies New Guinea, 1,200 miles long and 400 miles wide, with an area of 300,000 square miles. It is situated between 0 degrees 19 minutes and 10 degrees 2 minutes south latitude, and between 128 degrees 23 minutes and 146 degrees 15 minutes east longitude. At noon, while the first mate was shooting the sun, I could make out the summits of the Arlfalx mountains rising in terraces and then ending in sharp peaks. This island was discovered in 1511 by the Portuguese Francisco Serrano, and was then visited successively by Don Jose de Menzies in 1526, and by Grijalva in 1527, and by the Spanish General Alvar de Saavedra in 1528, by Inigo Ortez in 1545, by the Dutchman Schouten in 1616, by Nicholas Srook in 1753, by Tasman, Dampier, Fumel, Carteret, Edwards, Bougainvillea, Cook, Forrest, McClure, by d'Entrecasteaux in 1792, by Duperrey in 1823, and by Dumont d'Urville in 1827. De Rienzi stated that this was the original home of people who occupy the Malay archipelago, and I felt certain that our hazardous course would bring us face to face with the fearful Andamanes. The Nautilus was therefore entering the most dangerous strait on earth, one which the bravest navigators had hardly dared approach, which Luis Paz de Torres had confronted coming back from the South Seas in Melanesia, and in which, in 1840, the grounded ships of Dumont d'Urville came near to going down with all hands. But the Nautilus, heedless of the sea's dangers, was about to navigate among these coral reefs. Torres Strait is about 100 miles wide, but it is obstructed by all kinds of reefs, islands, reefs, and rocks, which made it nearly impossible to sail through. As a result, Captain Nemo took all the necessary precautions before entering it. Then he started out, cruising slowly along the surface. The Nautilus's propellers struck the water in a slow rhythm, like the tail of a huge whale. Taking advantage of this situation, my two companions and I stationed ourselves on the platform, which was, as always, deserted. Before us rose the helmsman's compartment, and I felt sure that Captain Nemo himself was inside, guiding his Nautilus. In my hands I held the splendid charts of Torres Strait made by the hydrographic engineer Vincendon Dumoulin, with the assistance of Ensign Coupvent de Bois, who was now an admiral, both of whom were part of Dumont d'Urville's staff during his last trip around the world, along with those made by Captain King. These are the best charts with which to unravel the tangled web of this narrow passage, and I was following them closely. Around the Nautilus, the sea was boiling furiously. The current, traveling from southeast to northwest at a speed of 2.5 knots, broke over the corals emerging from the sea around us. "What an awful stench of water," said Ned Land. "Terrible," I said, "and hardly suitable for a ship like the Nautilus." "That darn captain must be very sure of his course, because I could see bunches of coral that would only have to graze the hull to knock it into 1,000 pieces." It was, indeed, a dangerous situation, but the Nautilus slipped past these terrible reefs as if by magic. He did not follow the route of the Astrolabe and the Zélé, which had proven fatal to Dumont d'Urville. He went farther to the north, ran along Murray Island, and came back toward the southwest near Cumberland Passage. I thought he would surely run aground once and for all when he took the ship through a large number of almost unknown little islands near Tound Island and Evil Channel. I was wondering whether Captain Nemo, rash almost to the point of madness, intended to sail his ship through the strait where Dumont d'Urville's 2 corvettes had gone aground, when once again he changed his course and headed due west toward Grubauer Island. It was then about 3 in the afternoon. The current was easing off. It was almost full tide. The Nautilus approached the island, which I can still see with its remarkable border of screw pines. We were less than 2 miles from its shore. Suddenly a blow knocked me over. The Nautilus had just struck a reef. It remained immobile, listing slightly to port. When I got up, I saw Captain Nemo and his first mate were on the platform. They were examining the ship's position, exchanging several words in their incomprehensible language. Here was our situation. 2 miles to starboard rose Grubauer Island, whose coast extended from north to west like an immense arm. Toward the south and east, we could already make out the tops of several coral formations, which the ebb tide was beginning to uncover. We had gone aground at high tide, which would make it difficult to refloat the Nautilus. Nevertheless, the ship had suffered no damage, for her hull was solidly joined. But even though it could never sink or spring a leak, there was a serious danger of remaining grounded forever in these reefs, and that would be the end of Captain Nemo's submarine. I was thinking about all this when the captain came over, looking as cool and calm as ever. He seemed neither perturbed nor unhappy. An accident? I asked. No, an incident, he replied. But an incident, I retorted, that will force you once again to live on that land that you have been fleeing. Captain Nemo gave me an odd look and made a gesture of denial. It was his way of stating that nothing would ever force him again to set foot on land. He then said, "No, Monsieur Aronnax, the Nautilus is not lost. It will still take you through the wonders of the ocean. Our voyage is only beginning, and I have no desire to deprive myself so quickly of the honor of your company." "Nevertheless, Captain Nemo," I said, paying no attention to his irony, "the Nautilus went aground at high tide. Now, in the Pacific, the tides are not strong, and if you can't unballast the Nautilus, which seems to me impossible, I don't see how it can be refloated." "You're right, Professor," replied Captain Nemo. "The tides in the Pacific aren't strong, but in Torres Strait there is all the same a difference of 5 feet between high and low tide. Today is the 4th of January, and in 5 days there'll be a full moon. Now, I'll be very surprised if this obliging satellite doesn't raise these waters and do me a service for which I will be very grateful to her." With this, Captain Nemo and the first mate went back inside the Nautilus. The ship no longer moved. It was immobile, as if embedded in a solid masonry of coral. "Well, monsieur," said Ned Land, coming over to me after the captain left. "Well, Ned, we're going to wait calmly for the high tide of the 9th. It seems that the moon is going to be obliging enough to float us again." "Just like that?" "Just like that." "And the captain isn't even going to try putting anchors out and heaving the boat off the reef with winches?" If the tide will do the trick," said Conseil simply. The Canadian looked at Conseil and shrugged his shoulders. The sailor in him could not accept such a situation. "Monsieur," he said, "believe me when I say that this hunk of iron will never sail again in the water or under it. It's only fit to be sold by the ton. So I think the time's come to part company with Captain Nemo." "Ned, my friend," I answered, "I don't think the Nautilus's situation is as bad as you make out. In 4 days we'll know how much faith we can put in these Pacific tides. Besides, it would be one thing to think about escaping if we were off the coast of England or southern France, but in New Guinea it's another matter, and what's more, we'll have plenty of time to think about escaping if the Nautilus doesn't manage to get free of these reefs. And then we'll be in an even worse situation." "But couldn't we even look over the ground a bit?" Ned Land continued. "There's an island over there. On that island there are trees. Under those trees there are animals carrying around chops and roast beefs. I wouldn't mind a bit sinking my teeth into a little good meat." "This time Ned's right," said Conseil. "I agree with him. Couldn't Monsieur get his friend Captain Nemo to take us to that island, if only so we don't forget how it feels to be on dry land?" "I can ask him," I said, "but he'll only refuse." "We would appreciate it if Monsieur would give it a try," said Conseil. "And then we'll know just how good the captain's intentions are." To my great surprise, Captain Nemo not only granted me the permission I asked, but did it with great willingness and readiness, without even making me promise to come back on board. But escaping across New Guinea would have been very dangerous, and I would never have advised Ned Land to try it. It was better to be a prisoner on board the Nautilus than fall into the hands of the natives on that island. The dinghy was put at our disposal for the following morning. I did not ask whether or not Captain Nemo was going to come with us. I even felt sure that no member of the crew would accompany us, and that Ned Land would be left in charge of sailing the boat. Besides, it was less than 2 miles to shore, and the Canadian could have no trouble at all taking this light dinghy through the reefs, so fatal to large ships. The next day, January 5th, the dinghy was unlashed, taken out of its compartment, and launched from the platform. It only took 2 men to perform the entire operation. The oars were already in it, and we had only to take our places. At 8 o'clock, armed with guns and axes, we left the Nautilus. The sea was quite calm, a light breeze coming from the land. Conseil and I were at the oars, rowing vigorously, and Ned Land steered us through the narrow passages between shoals. The dinghy proved easy to manage and scooted along at a brisk pace. Ned Land couldn't maintain his joy. He was like a convict who had broken out of jail, and he didn't give a thought to the fact that he would have to return. Meat, he would keep on repeating. We're going to eat meat. And what meat? Real game. And to think that we never get any bread. I'm not saying I don't like fish, but you mustn't overdo a good thing. And it'll be nice for a change to have a piece of fresh venison grilled over a charcoal fire. Oh, you glutton, said Conseil. Stop it, you're making my mouth water. We still don't know if there's game in these forests, I said, nor if what game there is might not be so big that it could hunt the hunter. You might be right, Monsieur Aronnax, replied the Canadian, whose teeth seemed to have been whetted like an axe blade. But I'd eat sirloin of tiger if there were no other four-legged animals on this island. Ned's beginning to make me nervous, said Conseil. I don't care what kind it is, continued Ned Land. But the first animal I see with 4 feet and no feathers, or with 2 feet and feathers, will be greeted with a gunshot. There you go, Ned, I said, flying off the handle again. Don't worry about me, Monsieur Aronnax, replied the Canadian, and keep rowing. Before 25 minutes are up, I'll be able to offer you some really tasty dish. At 8:30, the Nautilus's dinghy ran gently aground on a sandy beach, after safely passing through the coral reefs surrounding Gueborour Island. And there we go. That is the conclusion of Chapter 20 of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And so now, when you join us again, we'll be back again on Wednesday at 4 p.m., we will read chapters 21 and 22, and we will find out what happens on the island to our heroes. Thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you for getting through all those interesting Latin words there. And hopefully we'll see you again on Wednesday for our next 2 chapters. Thank you very much. We'll see you again. Bye.